We have finally arrived here in October. My favorite holiday of the year is Halloween, so I'm stoked to finally have some fun with it video-wise. Last year, we took a little time to go over my favorite horror film of all time in John Carpenter's The Thing, and this year I want to do something a little different. Specifically, instead of my favorite horror film, we're going to be talking about my favorite type of monster, the vampire. To mix it up even more, I figured we'd take a few different stories about these bloodsuckers from the land of the rising sun. This week, we're going to have a look at Shiki. So what is Shiki exactly? Well, it started its life as a novel written in 2 volumes by Japanese novelist Fuyumi Ono, most famous for her fantasy series The 12 Kingdoms in 1998. Fun fact, she's actually married to the person who created the horror series Another. Anyway, after the novel, it was adapted into a manga that ran from 2007 until 2011. And then the anime was based off of that adaptation and was released in 2009. The anime was directed by Tetsuro Amano, who is most famously known for directing Macross 7. Another notable person that worked on the show is Yasuharu Takanashi, who also did the soundtracks for Naruto Shippuden and Fairy Tail, which is unfortunate, but he also did Hellgirl, the recent remake of Bastard, and Record of Ragnarok. I feel like he's worth bringing up here because his soundtrack on this show is downright inspired. But first, let's talk about what exactly Shiki is about. If you were to call this a Japanese answer to Stephen King's Salem's Lot, or maybe even 30 Days of Night, you really wouldn't be that far off. In fact, Shiki is actually dedicated to Stephen King and that book. There's definitely some parallels between the two, but there's also very clear influences from the original Dracula in this story as well. Specifically with one of the characters feeling like an homage to both Dr. Seward and Dr. Van Helsing from Dracula. The story is set in the Japanese countryside, and like I already spoiled, it's about vampires. Basically, a vampire family has a castle-like mansion built on the edge of town, and one by one they start infecting the village. The story is a slow burn over the course of 20 plus episodes that crescendos upwards as a few key players start to figure out what's going on. The main 3 characters that we follow are the aloof, I don't want to be in this small town teenager named Natsuno Yuki, the town doctor of Toshio Ozaki, who is the aforementioned parallel to Dr. Seward and Dr. Van Helsing, and then the junior monk and novelist Seishin Muroi, who is a parallel to both Father Callahan and Ben Mears in Salem's Lot. Granted, there's a very sizable cast of enjoyable characters, but these 3 are the main players. Now, I've sort of given the basic gist of the plot, so I'll talk spoilers later. I'd rather talk about the pros and cons at this point. Let's actually get the cons out of the way. One thing that I noticed about Shiki and its art style is what I would call stereotypical anime, and to be honest with you, it's the only con that I could think of in the story. Well, it's the only con unless you consider slow burn horror to be a negative. But either way, the thing about the anime's art style, and I hate to be so blunt about it, but I feel like the style and the character design was very purposeful in a lot of ways, but I can see why it would turn people off when you first see it. The funny thing about it is that it's used in a way to make you have certain assumptions about characters within the show, and based on their designs, some of these assumptions are going to be correct, and then some of them actually get subverted. Now, on the downside of that sort of thing, obvious villains are obvious, but on the flip side, other characters that you think are going to be totally villainous don't end up being that way. It's a nice little touch that pulls your attention in one direction in some cases just to swerve you in another to keep you on your toes as the plot unfolds. Just as an example, the family that brings the vampirism to this town, the Kirishikis, couldn't look more obviously evil if they tried. I mean, the patriarch of the family looks like Maester Seymour from Final Fantasy X. The little girl is obviously a vampire as well. She may as well have a sign around her neck that says Professional Exsanguinator. On the other hand, the character of Masao Murasako is drawn to look like a Marilyn Manson stunt double, and he ends up becoming a bit more sympathetic as the story goes on, given that he's basically the victim in the whole situation. Well, in the anime. Apparently in the book, the dude's a total psycho, but we're not reviewing the book, we're reviewing the anime. I had mentioned beforehand that the music for this show is downright inspired, and I feel the need to say it again. The music for the show is downright inspired. Though I did mention the composer working on what I would consider shonen slop, Takanashi's also worked on darker stuff as well, like Gantz and Mononoke. This is a very moody soundtrack that honestly kind of feels like something Akira Yamaoka might have put together if there was ever a Silent Hill anime. It extends to the sound design in general, with the whole sound suite just constantly putting you in a constant state of discomfort. Wow, I'm saying constantly a lot, so I'm going to constantly keep going. Anyway, granted, I'm of the opinion that when horror is at its best, it's not just jump scares, but a constant state, there's that word again, of unease. Almost like you feel like you're just in a place where you know where you should be anywhere but there. Sort of like being thrown into the middle of a furry convention while they're in the middle of playing Find the Diaper. Anyway, another thing that I really appreciate about this show is its ability to nail the small town feeling. Though there's some obvious differences between small town United States and small town Japan, when I was watching this I couldn't help but be reminded of the small towns I had lived in over the years after my family moved out of Chicago. Everyone knows everybody. Everybody keeps tabs on everyone else's business, even if you don't want them to. There's always rumors, there's always drama, and there's always one or two kids that honestly just wants to move out of the town and into a bigger city. I would know I was one of those kids. Trust me, going from Chicago to southern Illinois was a significant culture shock. There's no good pizza places, no arcades, nobody knew how to make Italian beef, and everybody was white and seemed to not know how to season things. Anyway, it echoes that sort of cramped feeling quite well that comes from living in a small town, and I just have a great appreciation for that sort of a feeling. Speaking of appreciation, I have to say I adore how the vampires get treated in this. Nobody's reaction to their unlife is the same as another, provided you are a character of consequence. Some absolutely fucking love being vampires, and others despise it or even go to the length of starving themselves so they won't hurt anybody. They even hunt in different ways. Some just brute force it, others will use seduction to gain new prey, or others will manipulate their family members to get a meal. In a way, it serves to make the threat seem that much more threatening and unpredictable, because you never know how they're going to approach a situation. Oh, side note, I feel like the show might have the biggest upgrade in an opening theme I've ever seen in an anime. But then again, it's because the first theme honestly feels out of place for a horror series, but the second one's fucking incredible and fits perfectly. Plus, the imagery of the second opening hits a lot better, as well as giving the impression that by the end of this, nobody in this series will have clean hands, which is accurate. Okay, side note over. I think the only gripe that I really have with the story, without going into spoilers, is that I'm kind of hoping that the writer of the story wasn't intending to try and make the vampires that sympathetic in the end. I don't think she was, but, if that's what she was going for, then I'm actually going to be kind of disappointed. Regardless, though, my first impression of the story when I watched the anime years ago was the basic idea is that everything that is touched by the vampiric curse is just destined to spread death and misery, and you're just watching the events unfold as a bystander that's kind of left with this feeling of you poor, poor souls by the end of it. At the same time, this is the type of story that I know double-digit IQ motherfuckers would try and say that this shows that humanity is worse than the vampires, or some fucking bullshit to try to equate the murderous monsters to, like, gay people or some minority group. I'll say it right out of the gate that this sort of thing's not happening here. The fact is, by the end of the story, the best way to describe it without spoilers is that nobody wins, and nobody is ever gonna win. These monsters come in with a plot, and then when the humans fight back, they bring a brutality and efficiency that the vampires were not expecting. There's definitely shades of gray, but the vampires in this story are all bad people. It's just levels of bad. There's no other way to slice it. Honestly, if you are looking for a story where the humans and vampires seem equally dickish, and there are a little bit more broader themes played with, go play the Legacy of Kain series. Granted, you should play the Legacy of Kain series anyway, because it's fucking incredible, but especially if what I described Shiki as not being, in regards to having more defined shades of gray, and everybody kind of sucks, if that's something you want, you're not going to get it in Shiki, go with Legacy of Kain. Anyway, let's get into the spoiler section, since I want to go a bit more in-depth in regards to the depravity and the characterization that's in this. If you don't want to be spoiled, go to this timestamp, or just follow the chapters down below. Okay, so let's talk about the overall story. Like I mentioned, the basic idea behind this is that vampires come to a town, start killing and turning people, and we follow the characters either as they're turning and how they deal with their transformation, or the discoveries made as the citizens uncover what the plot is. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between Salem's Lot and some from Dracula. To me, the most interesting character to follow is Dr. Ozeki, considering he basically has to figure out what the cause of everything is. This is why I compare him to Jack from Dracula and also Van Helsing. In the original novel of Dracula, Jack finds himself having to figure out what's going on with the character of Lucy, who seems to constantly be sick and needs consistent blood transfusions just to stay alive. This process, oddly enough, is inside the show as well, with a couple of patients going through similar traumas to what Lucy did in the original novel of Dracula. However, when Dr. Ozeki figures out exactly what he's dealing with and the vampires make the mistake of going out of their way to kill one of his patients and screw with him, things take a turn for the more fucked up. This is also why I compare Ozeki to Van Helsing, especially if you think of Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of the character. Now, Ozeki is nowhere near as eccentric as Anthony Hopkins' Van Helsing, but Van Helsing's approach to the vampires is scientific in nature. He has no bones about the violence that's needed to slay the vampires, and his approach to that kind of violence is very matter-of-fact and very clinical. He knows how they operate, and he knows how to finish them off, and that blood is going to have to get shed. It's unfortunate, it sucks, but you got to do it. The differences between Van Helsing and Ozeki is that Van Helsing's a Christian, first and foremost, and second, he doesn't have a personal stake in the matter of the story of Dracula to the degree that Ozeki does in the story of Shiki. There's an entire sequence where Ozeki gets his hands on a vampire and experiments on the creature to ascertain its weaknesses and strengths. There's just one problem. It's his fucking wife. Yeah, the two clearly were in a marriage that, during the course of the story, seemed about as arranged as it gets in the 1990s, but there wasn't really any malice between the two or anything. They just seemed distant from one another. In fact, when she first dies, Ozeki seems very busted up about it. Thing is, once she rises again, the methodical way that he goes about the process of studying vampirism is so clinical and cold that it's honestly the scariest part of the show. And that's saying something. You get the sense that Ozeki has basically snapped, and he doesn't see his wife as his wife anymore, but as sort of an imitation of life. The one segment that made me realize it is when he finally dispatches her and just leaves her on the table with her panties and ass exposed to the world. No, he didn't do anything dirty to her, you fucking pervs. What he did was he severed her femoral artery to see if that's a way to kill a vampire, and she healed instantly. It's just the lack of dignity that he gives to her when he puts her out of her misery that's honestly the most shocking part. He never addresses her or talks to her during the entire process. He just goes about it like she's a cadaver that just happens to be moving, basically constantly ignoring everything she's doing and the obvious pain that she's in. And then, of course, once he dispatches her, he won't even take the time to pull her fucking pants up to give her a little bit of dignity as she's dead. It's easily the hardest scene in the entire story to watch. What's wild to me about the sequences is not making a broad statement about all the people hunting vampires. It's basically just giving you an idea of the mentality of Dr. Ozeki. The reason I say this is that, well, the way that the village handles it is different from vampire to vampire. But honestly, in some cases, the way that they dispatch them can be downright merciful. For example, there's a pair of vampires in the story that honestly hate what they've become, with one being willing to starve to death to try to save people. I won't go too in-depth because I do want you guys to watch this, but you know, we're going through spoilers, so I'm assuming you went into the spoiler section coming back from watching this. But anyway, the reason I'm saying what I'm saying is that those two particular characters, when we see their fate, they did get staked, just like Ozaki's wife did. Well, without their underwear showing. But anyway, whoever did them in gave them peace. You can tell this very simply from body language. Obviously, they're staked, but they've been arranged body-wise like they're in coffins. And they look at peace, like they've finally been put out of their torment. Oddly enough, in a weird way, if death can be heartwarming, that was a way that it could do it, because you felt for those characters while they were suffering, and to see them at peace and finally being able to rest, in a weird way, it's a good feeling. It's in a very dark way. That or I'm just screwed up in the head. I'll leave that up to your own interpretations. I guess I should backtrack for a second. One thing that gets brought up often when this series is discussed is exactly how the citizens of the town react when there's a consensus of the fact that these are vampires. As you'd expect, a mob forms, and everybody gets organized. The way that the vampires get killed is pretty brutal, and the way that the bodies get dispatched becomes so formulaic that staking a vampire that's still twitching just kind of seems like it's a normal thing now. You can just do it, wipe the blood off your hands, and then go eat some onigiri. The way that the vampires get killed is pretty brutal, but depending on how you look at the situation, you're going to see it as either shockingly violent, or it's going to come across as incredibly cathartic. I'm in the latter camp, because episode after episode, I watched these bloodsuckers killing person after person just for food. They had no attachment to it, they didn't fucking care. They killed men, women, and children. A lot of them got a kick out of it too. And lo and behold, if you're gonna start killing people's family members and do it with a smile on your face, the town's gonna be coming back to you with the fury of our Maker's hand. I mean, some of these deaths honestly have me saying, dude, you fucking deserve it. Especially the character of Megami Shimizu. This chick got a kick out of being a vampire. She got a kick out of people dying unless it was her school crush. She got a kick out of being evil. When she finally gets dispatched by Truck Coon and a bunch of tractors running her over like she's a hooker in Grand Theft Auto, I jumped out of my seat and cheered. Because she deserved it. She had it coming. Not to mention, it's not like these people in the show are actual vampire hunters. They're not going to kill these people clean. They don't know how to. They're not prepared for this sort of thing like someone like Blade is in the Blade films and the comics. These people are just farmers and country folk. They've just got tools at hand and they're scared out of their minds. They want to make the bad thing go away. The process of dispatching these vampires is not going to be pretty. The thing about Shiki as a story, though, is that it is a tragedy. The whole reason that this whole thing got started is because the little girl vampire wanted her own town of fellow vampires to feel like she belonged somewhere, after another vampire, hundreds of years prior, had killed her family. We're presented with her backstory as a reason to understand her motivations, but I honestly don't think that it was the writer's intent for her to feel justified whatsoever. The tragedy of the situation is in its ending. Entire families have been destroyed, the survivors of the village end up having to leave it because it goes up in flames, the little girl vampire becomes a karma Houdini because the priest actually sympathized with the monsters after seeing what his best friend and Dr. Ozuki did to his wife, and ultimately, everything that happened to all these people is because a little girl felt lonely and got selfish. The ending of the story just leaves you with this feeling of sadness. Because even though the vampires got what was coming to them in spades, so many people died, and there's the possibility that it could happen again in the future. There might be some people that survived, and maybe they'll be able to rebuild their lives elsewhere, but they were basically chased out of house and home by monsters. Now, personally, I have a solution for the possibility of future vampiric infiltration, and it's right here.
Where are the traitors?
They are everywhere.
Honored brother, join us, and you may sate your rage and aid our cause. Lead me to the slaughter! Fuck you!
So do I recommend Shiki? Abso-fucking-lutely. Hell, I'd argue that this is probably one of the best horror anime that's ever been made. It has wonderful characterization, it uses its art style in an interesting way, has a goated soundtrack and sound mixing, great voice acting in both English and Japanese, which I admittedly probably should have talked about more, but whatever. And though it takes obvious inspiration from Dracula and Salem's Lot, it honestly is doing enough of its own thing, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to just imitate Bram Stoker or Stephen King. Plus, it's got a lot of substance to it, which I feel horror sometimes struggles with as a genre, but this is a series that delivers the scares and also delivers the feels. Highly recommended by yours truly. So for the next bit of vampire stuff, we're going to get a little Catholic up in here. But until then, thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget, of course, like, share, and subscribe. My name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. I'll see y'all next time.